Welcome, everyone. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to join us for today's webinar, Insights from Elon Musk's Starlink Success. I'm Matt Caspari. I'm a managing partner at Alumni Ventures, and I'm a leader of our Deep Tech Fund. I'm very excited to be hosting today's webinar and leading the conversation with Craig Moffett. Before I dive in, I'll start by reading a few legal disclosures. So we are speaking today about Alumni Ventures and our views of the associated landscape. This presentation is for informational purposes only and is not an offer to buy or sell securities, which are only made pursuant to the formal offering documents for the fund. Please review important disclosures in the materials provided for you for the webinar, and you can access those at av-funds.com/disclosures. And a few quick housekeeping items. You will not be on camera and will be muted throughout the entire webinar, and we are recording this webinar. So in terms of our agenda for today, I'll start out by giving you a bit of background on our Deep Tech Fund. I'll talk briefly about a blog post that I wrote that's led to this webinar. So that was on 5 practical ways venture capitalists are investing in the race to monetize space. And then the bulk of the time today, which we're all here for and excited about, is the conversation with Craig. So just a little bit of background on the Deep Tech Fund, and maybe I'll start even at a higher level, talking quickly about our parent company, Alumni Ventures. So first, our mission at Alumni Ventures is to democratize access to the venture capital asset class. So we're here to help individual investors access venture capital, which historically has been very difficult to get access to, but has also offered the opportunity for potentially significant returns. And we're here to democratize access and help individual accredited investors access venture capital. We are America's largest venture fund for individual investors. So at Alumni Ventures, we have over $1 billion in total capital raised across our different funds, and that comes from over 10,000 investors. And PitchBook said that Alumni Ventures was the most active venture capital firm in the US last year. And our portfolio at Alumni Ventures has grown now to over 1,000 companies. So within Alumni Ventures, I have a role of being a leader of our Deep Tech Fund. With this fund, we build a portfolio of about 15 to 20 investments that's constructed over about a year. The Deep Tech Fund is open to all accredited investors, and it has a $25,000 minimum investment amount and goes up to $10 million maximum. The fund is diversified. We do that by investing across different stages, so from the seed early stage of venture capital through later stage investments. We invest across different regions. And we also invest alongside different lead investors. So our role at Alumni Ventures is as a co-investor. That means that other firms are leading around negotiating terms with the entrepreneurs, often taking a board seat, and we invest alongside them into those same companies. So the team, we've got a great team managing the Deep Tech Fund. A little bit on myself, I come to Alumni Ventures having been an entrepreneur. I started a deep tech company called Aurora Biofuels. I was the founding CEO there. We were taking waste carbon dioxide emissions and turning that into biofuel. That company raised well over $100 million in capital and grew to over 100 employees before being acquired by Reliance Industries, a Fortune 100 company. Joining me as a leader of the Deep Tech Fund is Todd McIntyre. Todd has broad investing and operating experience, and prior to his role at Alumni Ventures, he was a managing partner of Gray Sky Ventures, which is a life sciences focused investment firm. We've got a great team, Aleem, Carl, Narain, all bringing diverse experiences and a lot of expertise around the deep tech sector to the team here. So just a snapshot. These are just some examples of the companies that we've invested in the past. If you have the time, I definitely recommend looking up all of these companies. I think they're all super exciting. You'll see a number of these are in the space sector, but you have other areas that we've invested in, including AI, which is obviously a very hot topic today. We've been investing in the space for many years, and even quantum computing with Xanadu. You'll see as you look across these companies that they are covering different sectors of deep tech. And you also see the types of investors that we've invested with historically listed as the co-investor. So again, our model is to invest alongside firms that we think have a lot of expertise in the sector in stage that we're making our investment. And we bring really our value add at Alumni Ventures is our network. We've built a very large network, again, of over 10,000 investors across our funds and 1,000+ portfolio companies. We're able to bring that to the table and help our portfolio companies tap into that network and leverage it to help build their businesses. So just briefly, hopefully some of you have had the opportunity to check out the blog that ultimately led to this webinar today. It was looking at Starlink's success, sorry, and the opportunities that's unlocked for venture capitalists. So some of those that we highlighted are listed on the slide here. Definitely recommend if you didn't have a chance to look at the blog to check that out. I'm not going to go through all of this today. I want to get to the conversation with Craig because I know we've got limited time. So we'll move right on to that. So Craig Moffett has been covering the telecommunications industry for over 30 years. I'll in a minute ask him to provide a little more color on his background, but he's been both a management consultant, did that for a number of years, and then moved on to be a leading Wall Street analyst. He's got a great track record, super deep expertise in this area, and I'm very excited to learn from him. So to set the stage for the conversation, we'd love to hear a little bit about your background, your career over the last 30 years, and maybe the key roles that you've had.
Sure. And first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be doing this. So look, I will make everything I say subsequently suspect by first saying that I started as an artist. I was a painter and sculptor, which is not your typical background for someone that ends up in tech finance. But in my
Love it though.
in my jack of all trades days, I after undergraduate school, where I did do my fair share of physics and that sort of thing as an artist, in an odd combination anyway, I had decided to get my graduate degree, and when I was doing my MBA, sort of turned to a more traditional management consulting background or path, and spent 11 years at the Boston Consulting Group, where I was titularly, I guess, I was the head of the global telecom practice by the time I left as a partner there. Yep. But I viewed myself as a specialist in high fixed, low variable cost businesses. I really enjoyed the microeconomics challenge of understanding competitive dynamics in businesses that had essentially zero variable cost, which, by the way, is characteristic of a huge part of Silicon Valley, and the tech sector, where digital businesses almost by definition have no marginal cost. I took a detour back to the art world, oddly enough, and ended up becoming one of those .com CEOs in the late 90s, running the internet business for the auction house Sotheby's, founding and running that business. And then decided to go back to telecom, where I went to Wall Street, and I've been now a Wall Street analyst for getting on 25 years, the last 11 of which have been in my own firm, Moffett Nathanson, that I started back in 2013.
Great. appreciate the context. Super interesting career path. I love it. So yeah, to set the stage, I mean, what does the current satellite communications landscape look like today? And maybe just for context for those of us who aren't super familiar, how does that compare in terms of scale and reach to physical broadband infrastructure?
Sure. Well, let me first go back a little bit to set the stage, because historically, the satellite business has been dominated by a technology called geosynchronous satellites. And geosynchronous satellites, as the name implies, if you're into actually parsing what that name implies, are satellites that are in orbit about 22,500 miles above the Earth. And because that is the calculated perfect height, such that the rate at which they orbit the Earth happens to match the rate at which the Earth rotates. And so they create the illusion of staying still above a single location. They don't actually stay still; they're racing around at an incredible speed, but they create the illusion of staying still, and that has a huge advantage in that one satellite can cover a particularly large location. As you can imagine, a cone of propagation from a satellite, when it's 22,500 miles up, covers a lot of the landmass. So you can do that technology quite cheaply. And that's historically the way the satellite industry has operated for the last, call it 50 years. It's only recently that a new technology called low Earth orbital satellite, or LEOs, have started to become the dominant technology, certainly the dominant technology as it relates to how much investment is going into the sector. A low Earth orbital satellite, much closer to the ground. So typically, call it 1,000 kilometers up. They typically are in the range of 600 miles to 1,500 miles.
Okay.
Those distances, by the way, are not that much different than, say, the distance from New York to Chicago or something. So the rate at which a fiber optic signal, or in this case, a speed of light ping from the Earth to a satellite and back, can traverse that distance is not really all that different than the rates that you would have in a typical terrestrial network. So the latency, or the amount of time it takes, is much, much better. The problem with that sort of a satellite constellation, and I've already tipped my hand in saying constellation, the problem with that technology is that those satellites don't match the rotation of the Earth. So they're moving incredibly quickly across the Earth. And therefore, you need a really large constellation of them in order to keep coverage continuously. And that makes it a really expensive proposition. So that sort of sets the stage for where we are today, because there's been a lot of talk historically about launching LEO satellites, but the economics never made sense. In the late 1990s, there were a few attempts, including famously companies like Teledesic and others that were going to do telecom in space, and they never made any sense economically. SpaceX, Elon Musk's company, is really the first one to launch a LEO satellite constellation of size. It's now in the high single digits of thousands of satellites. They will get to 15,000, but the runway actually says they could get as high as 42,000 satellites.
Wow.
It's an incredible number of satellites and an incredible cost. The point of that is the constellation that they call Starlink. And the point of Starlink is to bring broadband technology to unserved Earth locations. There was a lot of talk initially when they were first launching that they would be a substitute for terrestrial broadband, that is, from either your cable company or your phone company. That never made any sense. Realistically, it was never going to be cost-effective competition for places where satellite already exists, or where broadband already exists. But there are a lot of places where broadband doesn't exist. And not just in the US, by the way. In fact, in the US is not a terribly large market for this sort of thing, because it is pretty well wired as a country. But there's a lot of the world, by some estimates, 2.5 billion people that don't have access to broadband networks. So that's really the goal.
Okay.
And you've seen now a lot of capital pour into sectors that are aiming at serving the underserved rural broadband market.
Great. No, super interesting. Maybe a little more specifically on, you mentioned the capital inflows, but the venture capital dollars that we've seen flow into space tech startups, I think a lot of which are leveraging the much lower cost to get satellites up into the air, maybe specifically with SpaceX. What are your thoughts around that? Are there any specific technologies or companies that particularly have caught your eye or attention?
Well, first, I would say, and let me caveat it by saying my specialty is telecommunications networks and broadband, so I tend to be focused on that subsegment. There are a lot of segments of the space industry, as you can imagine. And I'll talk about Starlink and Elon Musk's SpaceX in a minute, because I think it's a really interesting concept. It's not to say that I'm particularly convinced it will end up being financially a good business,
Okay.
but it's a really interesting concept. But the first, it's important to think about what a satellite is, right? I think a lot of people have this image of a satellite that is the size of a minibus or something with big solar arrays on it and receiving and transmitting equipment and that sort of thing. Some of them actually are like that. The satellites that are being launched today, though, are in some cases as small as a laptop, and which part of the economics here really hinge on not just how much it costs to build one of these things. I mean, you can imagine they can be pretty expensive to build, but maybe just as importantly, how much they cost to launch.
Yeah.
The launch costs are a really, really important part of the equation, because these things can get heavy, and once they start to get heavy, it's not hard to imagine that the cost of shooting a bunch of them into space starts to be a pretty expensive proposition.
Sure.
Also, by the way, I'll digress for a moment, that for Elon Musk specifically, who has made a lot of his career around electric vehicles and trying to solve an environmental challenge. Launching satellites into space tends not to be very environmentally friendly, by the way.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
unfortunately not a way to
hydrocarbons.
electrify space launch. Yeah.
Yes, there's a lot of hydrocarbons
Yes.
expended in getting these things into orbit. Um, but so it's a complicated sector, though, in a lot of ways. And one of the things that makes it particularly complicated, and I think venture capitalists always have a good antenna for this, is to what degree is this sector likely to be exposed to regulatory or geopolitical risk? And in this case, it is extremely exposed to legislative and geopolitical risk. Remember, when you're launching a satellite, sort of self-evidently, I suppose, that goes zooming around the world, it's not entirely clear who the licensing authority is for that satellite. It's not obvious that the FCC in the United States has the discretion to say that a satellite over France can operate in the frequency that they say it can operate in.
Yeah.
And that same satellite is going to be over Guyana later, and it's going to be over Russia after that. So the licensing authorities are complicated, and the geopolitics are extremely complicated. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out that China is not going to allow a Western-dominated communications platform to serve national interests in China. So China will launch a satellite system, in fact, is now launching a LEO satellite system that will be directly competitive with SpaceX. It may or may not attract customers in Western economies, but it certainly shrinks the available market for somebody like SpaceX, who otherwise might sell in Chinese bloc countries.
Sure.
You'll see the same thing from Russia, where Russia is unlikely even to allow a Chinese satellite or constellation to hold the keys to what is deemed to be strategically sensitive technology. So you'll have a lot of these, and it's some of them may be purely for military use, but the obvious economics suggests that if you use them for more things, you can make it possible to launch more satellites and have more coverage. So that almost ensures that it's going to be a very competitive segment of the market, and tends to be therefore one of those. And by the way, you also have these vanity projects. Amazon is building Project Kuiper, and you have OneWeb in Europe, and you have all these different competing systems. The natural economics of these things would overwhelmingly suggest there ought to be just one, or maybe two. There's likely to be quite a few. It seems now relatively likely that Starlink has gotten such a head start that they will preempt a lot of other things from being launched, simply because it won't make any sense to be a late entrant into this market. It'll be obvious you won't make any money, but the geopolitics suggests that maybe nobody ends up making any money. These things still may exist. Now, again, there are lots of other segments of the space economy,
Sure.
from satellites that are doing surveillance and satellites that are doing geo-monitoring of all different kinds of things, besides, and lots of communications niches beyond just providing home broadband. But home broadband is such a capital-intensive market that I think it may turn out to be a really tough one to make money in.
Hey everyone, I want to take a quick break so I can tell you a bit about Alumni Ventures and our Deep Tech Fund. We offer smart, simple, and accessible venture portfolios for individual investors. We build diversified portfolios with low minimums, co-investing alongside established lead investors. It's a strategy that has mobilized over $1.3 billion from our community of more than 10,000 investors. With our Deep Tech Fund, you'll have the opportunity to invest in innovative solutions to major technical and scientific challenges, which can have a hugely positive impact on society. The deep tech sector encompasses areas such as AI, energy, quantum computing, semiconductors, space infrastructure, and more. We're committed to backing deep tech companies tackling important, hard problems with innovations that have the potential to redefine industries, create a more sustainable future, and deliver significant financial returns. So if you're interested in a portfolio of revolutionary companies, click the link below or visit us at av.vc.
And with the current constellation, I think you said maybe single digit thousands with Starlink today. What are the capabilities, and what additional capabilities do you get as they scale to tens of thousands?
Well, the main thing you get as you get bigger is more capacity, right? So we, some years ago, when this was still very early on, I think it was maybe 2 years ago, we did a fairly deep dive analysis of the economics just of the Starlink piece, not of SpaceX, and I'll come to the intersection of those in a minute, which is, I think, what makes it interesting.
Yeah.
But Starlink will think about just the US market for a second. The US represents about 4% of the landmass of the globe. And therefore, in a evenly distributed constellation of satellites that are traversing the globe at all latitudes, that's not quite the way it works, but it's close enough for government work. You will have about 4% of your capacity available to serve the United States at any given time. And if you do the calculations of the amount of payload that each satellite will have in terms of capacity, and then how much usage a typical home has at any given moment. By the way, that includes the moments they're not using it at all. So you have what's called oversubscription. You're not, even if you sell somebody a 100 megabits per second connection, obviously doesn't mean they're using 100 megabits per second all the time. But so you do all those calculations, and we figured there's probably room for 1 million or so US satellite broadband customers on the Starlink platform, which is far less than 1% of the population. Now, if you scale up the size of the constellation, you may get to a few multiples of that, but it's never going to be a particularly meaningful part of the US broadband landscape. It's useful in very rural areas that can't be reached any other way. And it may also be useful for aerospace. The satellite or the Wi-Fi that you get on an airplane. I think almost all of your listeners are probably quite familiar with how frustratingly poor it usually is.
Sure.
There are some airlines already that are using SpaceX, and it works better. Less latency and more capacity, and so it works better, and it will be good for the aerospace market. It will be good for the maritime market for ships at sea and all that sort of thing. So there are certainly niches that will be well served by this technology. Again, the question is whether you can offset the huge costs of building these satellites and launching them into space. And by the way, there's another enormous cost of these things that you can't forget about, and that is that the useful life of a satellite is something like 4 years. Unlike in geosynchronous orbit, when you're in low Earth orbit, the gravitational pull of the planet pulls these things down out of orbit, and then they burn up on reentry. And so you have to keep launching new ones to replace the ones that are falling out of space. And if you do the calculation on a 42,000 satellite constellation, when you reach steady state, it means you're launching 42,000 new satellites all the time, right? Just to replace the ones that are coming out of service every year. So the numbers say you will have to launch 70,000 satellites by the end of this decade in order to get to 42,000. And then you're in the business of launching a new rocket every 3 to 4 days just to replace the satellites that are falling out of space. So just a mind-boggling expense. What makes Starlink and SpaceX interesting is because SpaceX is also in the launch business. And as you would expect, a company that is launching rockets is typically doing that today for the government. Overwhelmingly, the largest consumers of rocket launches are governments. They're launching they're launching their own defense satellites and other government satellites. There is also a commercial launch business for companies that are launching satellites, but that's not nearly as large. What the concept of the confluence of Starlink and SpaceX together is that if, say, NASA or the Department of Defense or somebody else contracts for a large rocket launch, there may be sufficient excess capacity in the payload that you can stick some Starlink satellites up there and launch them for what amounts to no marginal cost. Because the satellite would be going anyway. That's the concept. Whether it really works that way is much less clear, because when you are a taskmaster to saying, I have to launch a rocket full of just these satellites every 3 or 4 days in perpetuity in order to keep the thing afloat, then that marginal cost of I'm going anyway sort of falls apart. And because it's not likely you're ever going to get to anything like that frequency of launches. But that was the concept, and what makes it sort of interesting. The rockets get bigger and bigger, but the satellites are also getting bigger and bigger, and therefore heavier and heavier, and it takes bigger rockets to launch them and so on. And that I came away relatively skeptical that this is ever going to be a moneymaker, even though I have no doubt there will be a vibrant rocket launch business, and that may turn out to be a bigger business. But most of SpaceX's valuation today, which by the way is astronomical, if you'll forgive the pun.
I think it's the most valuable private company is what I hear.
$100 billion. Eventually, that has to be supported by the cash flows that it generates and the return on invested capital that it generates. And I personally would have a really hard time underwriting that as a good idea for this particular space business. And that comes from someone who's actually quite optimistic about the space industry overall.
I'd love to hear a little more about, I think you said earlier on, it's something like 2.5 billion people that are there that don't have the access that we have in the US, bringing those people, online, giving them access to broadband. I assume most of that population doesn't have a lot of disposable income to spend on this. But have you done the math? What does that look like? What's that commercial opportunity?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's very hard to model what that opportunity might be. And it's funny. As I said in my preamble when I was talking about my background, I've been doing this a long time, so I've seen some of these things come and go. I was a ringside observer to the launch of a company called Iridium
Oh
in
yeah.
the late 1990s, and Iridium was a really fascinating case study. It was the first real communications satellite for personal connectivity that was aimed at providing connectivity wherever you are, where there's no cell service. And it was quite obvious by the time they were designing it in the late 1980s that cell service would never be economical to offer anywhere except in the dense areas of urban downtowns. And therefore, the vast majority of the world was going to be the target market for Iridium.
Sure.
Well, by the time it was launched, it was obvious that that was wrong. and that in fact, the majority of the populated parts of the planet already had phone service by that time. And now, 2 decades later, even more of it has phone service. So Iridium entered bankruptcy 2 years after it was launched. I mean, it was by the time it was launched, it was already obvious that it was going to be a lame duck and wasn't going to survive. And it still survives, by the way, serving some niche opportunities. For the last 20 years, it's been quite important to militaries, particularly in areas where there was no other connectivity or where for military strategic reasons you couldn't account on the existing networks because you were in enemy territory, for example, or that sort of thing. So it has had its purposes and it has survived, but it has survived in part because it was recapitalized at pennies on the dollar after it went bankrupt. I suspect we'll see some of that same dynamic. For example, let's just think about the US. When even as recently as when Starlink was introduced in order to offer service to its places, including the United States, there was a decent sized rural market in the United States that wasn't served by wired broadband. Well, then COVID came along, and around the same time that COVID came along, the Biden administration's Jobs Act came along, which it was a massive infrastructure project, a very large part of which was bringing broadband to rural America. It's not unlikely that within 10 years, the amount of territory in the United States, or the number of homes anyway, in the United States that aren't served by broadband terrestrially will be so small as to not be a particularly interesting market. The maritime market will still exist, the aerospace market will still exist, but the core rural market in the United States will largely go away. And this technology is just not really competitive with wired broadband. It's too expensive. The cost of satellite dishes to receive it is too expensive, and so on. So that same dynamic in different flavors is happening everywhere. There are big parts of India where there's a lot of population that aren't served by broadband networks. But those markets are increasingly being served by what's called fixed wireless access, where instead of providing a wire to every home, you drive cell towers reasonably deep into neighborhoods and then you connect them via wireless. Again, it's probably not quite as good or as robust as a wired network, but it's a lot cheaper. And so some of this
sense on
depends
how much cheaper than Starlink? Is it an order of magnitude or any?
Yeah, you can do it an order of magnitude cheaper than you can. Now, once a satellite constellation is up, it's very cheap. Providing the service once it's there, although in this case, again, if you're replacing satellites as they fall out of space, that's a pretty big recurring cost.
Yeah.
But the marginal cost of serving each individual customer is very small. But ultimately, for a government that's saying, I want to bring, or whether it's through private capital or government investment, I want to bring broadband to unserved parts of my population, whether that's in sub-Saharan Africa or whether that's in rural parts of India or whatever country you're talking about. There are technologies that you are likely to rely on well before you start to think, well, satellite's going to be the answer. And so you tend to see those places, those opportunities get smaller and smaller over time. And so the addressable market will be much smaller, I think, than you would model it today.
Interesting. Okay. And maybe put on your startup entrepreneur hat, or maybe you're advising an entrepreneur. For someone who's interested in this market and the opportunities that are opening up, maybe enabled by SpaceX, are there certain areas that you think are particularly interesting over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I suspect that SpaceX will create its own industry, sort of industries, in order to service SpaceX, if you will. Step back and think for a moment about, well, what is SpaceX going to be to an individual customer? Maybe here in the US, I will go on a website and I will order a SpaceX satellite from SpaceX. Is that likely to be the way that it is sold in Kenya? I doubt it. It's much more likely in Kenya that I will order it from some local distributor, who will both set up and service and provide billing and that sort of thing on behalf of SpaceX. There will be all these different industries that crop up around the creation of satellite technology. Some of them in retail servicing, just to use one example, but whether it's specific segments like serving boats and RVs, and or serving the aerospace industry. Serving the aerospace industry is completely different if you're talking about providing service for Delta or United than it is if you're dealing with small aircraft, for example. So all those different things will actually create a lot of startup businesses that are there to be part of what becomes an ecosystem around these LEO satellites. And those haven't really started yet. It's too early. And then obviously there are a huge number of consultancies and that sort of thing that are involved in the defense industries and government service industries that are still sort of central to what is the core to a large part of a company like SpaceX, and that is the launch business.
Excellent. Super exciting. I think we've got an exciting time ahead. Really appreciate all the insights and you taking the time. So just want to thank you for that.
My pleasure. It's been good to talk to you.
Great. So if you are interested in potentially investing with us in the Deep Tech Fund, we welcome you to explore with us. You can look at materials on the funds, or I highly encourage you to just book time with our team, hop on a call with us. We'd welcome speaking with you. So just want to, again, thank Craig for a great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope you all did as well. Wish you a great rest of your day. Take care.